everyone, this is Marika and welcome back to another session of Community Health Nursing with me. In our previous sessions, we have discussed about eugenics, we have discussed about the different measures of eugenics, we also discussed about various physical environment of a person which includes the water, air, noise and climate. In this session today, we are going to discuss a very interesting topic and a very important topic for us as nurses, which is communication. Now, communication is a very familiar term for everybody. But what is communication? What are the different types of communication? And why is communication important is what we are going to discuss in detail in today's session. Communication, as we know, is a way of conveying our idea, thoughts, or belief to another person. So we can say that communication is the process of sharing ideas or sharing information from one individual to another. Communication happens in a common language, right? In order to communicate, if I want to communicate something, if I want to convey a certain message to a group of people, I need to make sure that we speak in the same language or we have a common language so that the message that I want to convey is reached out to each and every group member. Communication is a way of conveying information, sharing information within one another. Now, to be more specific, we can say that communication is a process of conveying information from a sender to the receiver with a use of a channel. In order to send a message, in order to convey our information, there is a sender who wants to send the message, right? Then there is a message. The message is the content that I want to communicate, and then there is a receiver who receives the message. Now, the message that is sent from the sender is done with a use of a medium, and that medium is called as channel of communication. So basically, communication is a process of exchange of ideas, thoughts, and belief from one person to another. We can also say that the communication process is a social interaction where two or more people are involved. They communicate with one another, they convey their information to one another with the use of common language, and collaboration and cooperation among people happens through communication. I hope you've understood the basic idea of communication. Moving on, let us see the definition of communication. A very simple definition of communication says that communication, it is defined as a two-way process where there are various elements involved, and the elements are a sender, a receiver, the message, the channel, and the feedback. Now, this definition says that communication is a two-way process, which means it is not that in communication the sender sends the message and the process stops. It is a two-way process, which means there is a sender, as I said, there is a receiver, right? Now, these are the elements of communication where the sender has a message that has to be sent to the receiver. The sender takes the message, sends the message to the receiver with the use of the channel. The receiver receives the message and gives a feedback to the sender. For example, when I'm communicating with you all right now, I'm talking to you all right now, right? Now, this information, as it reaches to you, if I ask you if you have understood the topic, you'll give a certain response to me. Now, that is the feedback from the receiver. So, communication is a two-way process which includes different elements such as a sender, a receiver, a message, a channel, and a feedback. Let us also see another definition of communication. Communication is defined as a process of exchange of ideas, thoughts, beliefs, information, and values between two or more people. So obviously, communication is a process of sharing our ideas, thoughts, beliefs, values, and facts with one another. I hope you've understood what is communication. Moving on, let us see the communication process. We've already understood that there are 5 different elements of communication. Now, elements of communication are the most necessary thing for the communication to occur. Without the elements that we have discussed, communication process does not happen, it does not occur. In the screen here, you can see the entire communication process and the elements. The first element is the sender and another element is the receiver. Now here you can see the sender wants to send a message to the receiver, and the message is sent from the sender to the receiver with a use of a channel. Now once the sender sends the message to the receiver receives the message, the receiver decodes the message, and sends a response to the sender. Now that is called as a feedback or a response. There are 5 different elements of communication as we have discussed, which includes the sender, message, channel, receiver, and a feedback. Let us discuss in detail about each of the elements. The first element is the sender. Who is the sender? As the term suggests, a sender is the person who wants to communicate the message, who has the information and wants to communicate the information to a group of people or to another individual. Now, as a sender, when I'm communicating something, it is obvious that I want the receiver to receive the message and understand what I am trying to say to the receiver, right? The information that the sender has, the sender wants the receiver to receive it, decode it, and understand exactly the way I want it to be understood. So it is obvious that as a sender, I want the receiver to receive the message, to decode the message, as well as understand the message in exactly the same way what I want the receiver to understand. The intent of the message in a communication that is sent by the sender is either to ask the receiver to do something or to understand a certain information, right? When I'm communicating something to you as a sender, I have 2 intentions. The first intention is for me to ask you to do something, and the second intention could be to make sure the message that I have is understood by the receiver. I hope you've understood the first element of communication, which is the sender. As the term suggests, the sender is the person who wants to communicate a certain message. The sender has the message and wants to send the message to the receiver. The second major element of communication is the receiver. Again, as the term suggests, the receiver is the person who receives the message, or we can also say that the receiver is a person for whom the message was intended by the sender. Now, as a receiver, I receive the message, and after I receive the message, I have to decode the message. I have to try to understand what the message wants to communicate, and I have to process the thought and also determine how do I want to respond to the sender. Now, one very important thing that we need to understand is that we have 2 different people involved in giving out a message. There is the sender and the receiver. The education of the sender, the experience of the sender can be totally different from the education or the experience of the receiver. Therefore, the message that is communicated by the sender may not be perceived in exactly same way by the receiver. Moving on, let us see the third element of communication process. The third element is the message. What is a message? A message is the content of communication. The message is the content of communication. As a sender, what do I want to communicate to the receiver? What is the content of communication is the message. We can also say that the message is the key of communication. The fourth element of communication is the channel. As I said, the channel is the medium that is used by the sender to communicate the message. In order to communicate any message, a certain medium is used. Now, those medium which are used by the sender in order to communicate the message to the receiver, in order to convey the message to the receiver, is the channel of communication. The examples of channel of communication includes phone calls, text messages, social medias, videos, emails, etc. So these are the various channels that are used by a sender to communicate the message. Depending on the nature of message that is to be sent to the receiver, it is the sender who has to decide the channel of communication. Now, as a sender, I know what kind of message do I want to send to the receiver. So the channel must be selected appropriately. If the channel is not selected appropriately, the intention of the message will not reach to the receiver. For example, as a nurse, if I want to communicate a certain message to a group of people in the community, I know that the majority of people in the community are illiterate people or uneducated people. So if I use pamphlets, leaflets, or emails as a channel of communication in order to communicate those messages to the people, my message will not reach out to a large group of people in the community. It may reach out to few people who are literate or who can read and write. But to other group of people who cannot read and write, my message will not reach out to them, right? Therefore, my communication will not be a successful communication. Even though I have sent a message to the people, my message has reached to the people, but the message cannot be interpreted by those people because the channel that I used in order to communicate such message is not proper. Therefore, as a sender, we have to select the channel of communication appropriately. And the last element of communication process is a feedback. Now, again, as the term suggests, a feedback is a response that is given by the receiver after receiving the message from the sender. Feedback can be considered as one of the steps which helps the sender to understand if the message is properly reached out to the receiver or not, whether the receiver was able to understand the message exactly the way I wanted the receiver to understand or not. If the receiver has understood the message correctly, then the response that is given by the receiver will be appropriate. Otherwise, the response will not be appropriate for the sender. Now, the feedback process can be initiated from the sender side or also from the receiver side. For example, the sender may ask the receiver to repeat the message that has been communicated in order to ensure that the message has reached out to the receiver appropriately. The message that the sender wants to communicate has been appropriately perceived by the receiver. That is one of the ways through which feedback can be initiated. On the other hand, when we have a good listener as a receiver, the receiver himself will repeat the message in order to ensure that what he or she have heard is correct. So that is all about communication process. In the communication process, we've seen there are majorly 5 elements involved, which is a source, or can also be called as a sender or the encoder. The source, the sender, or the encoder is the person who encodes the message, who has the message, and wants to convey the message to a group of people or to another individual. Now, the message can be termed as the content of communication or the key of communication. It is what the sender wants the receiver to know. It is what the sender wants the receiver to know. It is what the sender wants to communicate. The third element of communication is the channel, which is the medium that is used by the sender to communicate the message to the receiver, to convey the message to the receiver. Channels have to be selected appropriately according to the experience, the education of the receiver in order to make sure that the message reaches out to the receiver in an appropriate manner. The channel is the medium which is used by the sender in order to make sure that the message reaches out to the receiver. The receiver can also be called as the decoder of the message, who decodes the message that is sent by the sender. Or we can also call the receiver as the target of communication. The sender has a target, which is the receiver. The sender encodes the message, uses the channel, sends the message through the channel to a target, which is the receiver. And finally, the receiver gives a response after receiving the message, after interpreting the message, which is called as a response or a feedback. Now, one very important thing for us to understand is the message or the content of the communication can be communicated, can be sent to the group of people or to another individual through various means, or it can be found in different forms such as spoken words, written words, and also use of gesture. Gesture is use of body language, use of hands, eyes, and facial expression in order to communicate certain message. For example, nodding of head. It is also a form of communication. Instead of saying yes or no when somebody asks us a question, we can even nod our head to give out a response. Those are the various gestures that are used for the communication process. Communication can be described as a creative, dynamic, continuous process rather than just exchange of information. So communication is not just about exchange of information, but it is a dynamic process, which means it keeps on changing. It is a continuous process because from the sender, the message is sent to the receiver gives a feedback, and at this particular time, the receiver becomes the sender while the receiver gives the feedback. So it is a continuous process, it is a dynamic process, and also a creative process because communication involves various techniques, various forms that can be used in order to convey a message from the sender to the receiver. So rather than saying that communication is just an exchange of ideas or thoughts, we should understand that communication is a creative, dynamic, and a continuous process. I hope you've understood what is communication and what is communication process. To summarize, today we have discussed about what is communication. I hope the class was helpful, and I'll see you all in the next session where we will discuss about types of communication as well as barriers of communication. Thank you and have a great day ahead.